Hey guys, Jake Brown here for Roto Curve, bringing you a site-by-site scoring comparison for PGA. Give me a moment, let me share my screen with you guys. All right, now you guys should be looking at what I'm looking at, which is that site-by-site scoring comparison. Has DraftKings and DraftPot, Victiv, Fantasy Aces, Draft Day, and Fantasy Feud. Now, I list DraftPot with DraftKings because the scoring is exactly the same in these categories, and it's not different. They just don't award points for bonuses, so these would all be zeros. Okay, so what I like to do when evaluating a new sport is looking for some important ratios and seeing how they differ across the sites. Obviously, you know not to look at the half-point par and compare it to a 2-point par and say that a par on Victiv is 4 times what it's worth on DraftKings. It's irrelevant how many points you award to the first thing you're deciding. After that, the points then create a ratio, which show you the value of the different scores on different sites for each hole. So I like to use par because 63.08% of all scores on holes last year on the PGA Tour were par. So it's the most common occurrence, always will be. It's what the golfers theoretically are shooting for. On DraftKings and DraftPot, you're looking at a 6-to-1 ratio of how many pars you would need to score to equal 1 birdie. That ratio is higher on DraftKings at 8-to-1, considerably lower on Fantasy Aces at 3-to-1, and even lower at Victiv at 2.5-to-1. The next most two common strokes in golf are birdies and bogeys. Last year, 18.75% of all scores on holes were birdies, and 15.66% were bogeys. I like to add the two together because in real life, when you do that, your golfer steps up and scores a bogey followed by a birdie. They have an even par score for the day, so their finishing position is unaffected. But you still don't receive the same amount of points as you would on the majority of these sites, as if your golfer came up, shot 2 pars, and their finishing position remained equally unaffected. On DraftKings, a bogey and a birdie combined is actually worth 5 pars. So in 2 holes, you've achieved what another golfer who shoots 5 straight pars would need to equal you. That number again is higher on draft day. And we'll stop for a second and note why it's higher. On draft day, they do not take away points for your golfer shooting over par. No penalty for bogeys, double bogeys, triples, quads. It obviously hurts your golfer's overall score, which will tie into their finishing position, which is relevant, but it does not penalize you round to round. On Fantasy Aces, that ratio is 2.5 pars to a bogey and birdie, making it slightly more valuable for your golfer to be a little bit erratic and go +1, -1 than it would be for them to go even. Victiv, however, there is absolutely no difference. If your golfer steps to the tee and shoots a bogey and birdie and steps to the tee and shoots 2 pars, the golfer's at the same spot on the leaderboard, and your fantasy team has the same amount of fantasy points. The fourth type of score I like to look at on each hole is an eagle. Eagles only occur on 0.41% of holes on the PGA Tour last year, but they can give you a sizable bonus as well as take your golfer 2 under par in 1 hole. On DraftKings, Eagles are worth 2.66 birdies. On draft day, they're worth 3. And on Fantasy Aces and Victiv, they're actually worth less at 1.66 and 1.8. Now, I don't want you to think that it would be better to score 2 birdies than 1 eagle on Victiv, as you're taking up 2 holes, and holes remaining are the name of the game. So an eagle and a par are actually considerably better than 2 birdies on Victiv. Fantasy Aces, it actually plays out that an eagle and a par equal 2 birdies. Now, perhaps the most important distinction to be aware of if you're playing on multiple sites is the progressive penalties for your golfer shooting above par on a hole. Now, on DraftKings, if your golfer shoots a bogey, you're looking at a -0.5, which cancels out a par score. double bogey, it's a 2-to-1 ratio, and that 2-to-1 ratio doesn't get any worse no matter how over par your golfer goes. Same cannot be said of Victive and Fantasy Aces, where you receive a -1 for a bogey, which takes away half a par score on Victive, and the same half a par score taken away on Fantasy Aces at -0.5 points. Where it gets dicey is the 4-to-1 ratio of the penalty for a double bogey to a bogey, and that exists on both Fantasy Aces and Victive. It gets even worse if you triple bogey. You're looking at a 7-to-1 penalty versus a standard bogey on Victive, and an 8-to-1 on Fantasy Aces, where it bottoms out, or where it levels out, I should say. And on Victive, they take it a step further, and if they step up to a par 4 and end up with a snowman, you're looking at a -10, which is a 10-to-1 ratio of penalty to a bogey. It also means if your golfer were to put up a quad and an eagle, you would be left in negative points, which isn't true on any of the other sites. On Fantasy Aces, you would be left with the equivalency of 1 par. On DraftKings, you're still sitting sky high. So these penalties for going deep over par on specific holes are very, very important to be aware of on Victive and Fantasy Aces. And depending on the format you're playing, a GPP versus a cash game, it should help you develop some form of strategy. And in the future, we will dig deeper into that. The next thing to look at are the bonuses you can achieve across the sites. Now, there are no bonuses to be achieved on Victive or Fantasy Aces. And on DraftKings and DraftPot, no bonuses. On DraftKings and Draft Day, you're looking at single round bonuses and 4-round bonuses. There are 2 ways to get a single round bonus on DraftKings. With a 3 birdie streak or a bogey-free round, you can only get one of the former each round, and you can look at achieving an extra birdie or 2 for your troubles. Draft Day, there's no 3 birdie streak, but you do receive 1.5 birdie equivalency for a bogey-free round. So there's a little bit of value in those bonuses. And again, you can get them each round. Now, there's a huge difference between the value of the 4-round bonus on those 2 sites. The 4-round bonus on DraftKings being 4 rounds in the 60s, and that would grant you 1.66 birdies, while also meaning your golfer is at least -4 to -12 under par, depending on the par for the course. On Draft Day, however, you're looking at the ability to rack up some serious 4-round bonus points if your golfer is able to shoot 4 rounds in the 60s. And that's because they award 2 separate bonuses. The easier bonus to achieve is 4 rounds at par or better. So as formerly mentioned, if par is 70, 71, or 72, as long as you receive par or better for all 4 rounds, you get a 10-point bonus. So you could get that 10-point bonus with 4 72s. If you happen to go 4 rounds under 70, you're looking at a 25-point bonus on Draft Day. But by nature of 4 rounds in the 60s also always being 4 rounds of par or better, that bonus is actually 35 points, which is an 8.75 birdie bonus compared to the 1.66 birdie bonus on DraftKings. So the 4-round bonus, the possibility on Draft Day is for it to be much steeper than on DraftKings. Those are also the 2 sites that award points for finishing positions. I should say Fantasy Aces does award a 10-point bonus if you have the winning golfer on your team. Now, Draft Day and DraftKings both award 30 points to their first place finisher. Now, be aware, as we've gone through everything, that 30 points is harder, much harder to achieve on DraftKings, making that finishing position bonus a higher percentage of your overall score. The other thing is that on DraftKings, you're looking at a distinct difference and a bonus from coming in first versus second. And on Draft Day, that bonus is really first, second, and third versus the remaining positions. There's a secondary advantage to coming in second to sixth, looking at always having 2 points between you and the next position, and that diminishes in seventh. And it's even less so, but slightly still real on Draft Day in that you're looking at a 1-point drop down in each of these positions, and then it drops to 2, as well as ranging off from single positions. So there is a slight advantage and more weight to 4th through 9th place than 10th through 60th. And I should mention that they do award points through 60th on draft day and only through 50 on DraftKings. So there's much more strategy we can talk about with that information at a later time. But what I want you to basically look at is some of the bolded sections should really highlight some of the key differences: the progressive bogeys, the 4-round bonuses, and then all the ratios up top. Now we also have Fantasy Feud, which is very much its own animal. Fantasy Feud only awards points based on finishing position. I'll repeat that. Fantasy Feud only awards points based on finishing position. Pars, birdies, bogeys, none of it matters. It's where they finish. I shouldn't say none of it matters, but it's not relevant statistically for Fantasy Feud. They actually pay out all the way down in terms of points to your golfers to finishing in 69th place, which means if your golfer makes the cut, there's a very, very little chance that they don't receive any points. And if we're looking at a standard 75 golfer cut, you're looking at 8% that aren't receiving that bonus. They're receiving a different bonus, however, for completing all 4 rounds, which is 10 points. If you have someone not make the cut, as a result, they're giving up 25 points plus to the other 92% of cut makers. Now they're giving up 10 points to that 8%, but to everyone else, they're giving up 25 points, and that would be if all the golfers on that team finished between 60th and 69th. So if your golfer doesn't make the cut, you're getting a 0 for that golfer, and 92% of golfers that make the cut are looking at scoring 25 to 100 points. So emphasizes cut making to the max. The scoring payouts, however, to first place, second, third, fourth, in terms of fantasy points allocated, are incredibly less steep than DraftKings, which for me blur the line a little bit into really determining whether this is just parlaying a bunch of golfers and whoever has the lowest score when you add up finishing position wins, but that's essentially how it works. I'm looking at some of the steepness ratios. First to 10th on DraftKings in terms of fantasy points allotted is a 4.29 ratio. Look at that 2-to-1 ratio on Fantasy Feud. For second on DraftKings, you're looking at that 30-to-20 ratio for a 1.5. Here it's 190. And we go over to DraftKings and go down to 4th place, receiving 16 points, 40th receiving 2. It's an 8-to-1 ratio. 4th here looking at 80, 40th here looking at 25. A little under a 4-to-1 ratio. So just some examples. But Fantasy Feud is essentially a very simple way to play, but it's an entirely different animal that forces your, I wouldn't say forces, but would lead you to not approach things at all in the same fashion and not value things nearly as much as these other sites. And since the bread and butter of daily fantasy sports for the majority of players tends to be statistical evaluation and putting together a roster based on that statistical evaluation, Fantasy Feud doesn't really follow suit with the other games, and I personally don't view it as much of a game of skill as a result. All right, guys, I hope that was helpful. This is Jake Brown, Versatile on Twitter for RotoCurve. Please feel free to reach out and message me. I'll try to get back to all of you, and have a great day.